and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, here with my co-host, Bethany Ruff.
Hello, hello.
And we have an amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. Angela Stanton is a neuroeconomist who evaluates changes in behavior, chronic pain, decision-making, and hormonal variations in the brain. Her current research is focused on migraines and their causes, treatments, and prevention without the use of medicines. As a long-term migraine sufferer herself, she focused her research on the biochemical imbalances that are at the root cause of migraines. In her career, she has authored several peer-reviewed studies and articles. She is the author of the book, Fighting the Migraine Epidemic: How to Treat and Prevent Migraines Without Medicine, which is full of helpful and practical information. She developed the Stanton Migraine Protocol, which is now the gold standard for migraine prevention and treatment. Dr. Stanton, welcome to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you. Really nice talking to you. Thank you for inviting me.
It is an absolute pleasure to host you. What an interesting mix. So my wife and I, we do this thing where we, like if we have something embarrassing or funny that we do, we'll try to like hide it from the other person. And then sometimes we'll tell the other person we call it a marriage confession. And then you have to reveal like whatever stupid or embarrassing thing that you kind of goofed up. And I have a podcast confession that I had to read Neuroeconomist to myself 100 times before setting up this call. That's a hard word for me to say. What in the world is a neuroeconomist?
Okay, so a neuroeconomist is actually really two fields combined. So a neuroeconomist is primarily an economist who is using neuroeconomic experiments and tools to evaluate an economic or financial behavior. And so my experiments were basically the PhD itself is a PhD in economics. So it's a hardcore mathematical, physical, economics background, but you have to have sort of kind of doctorate level understanding of some other fields. So for example, my doctorate had to contain 4 fields in order for it to be officially neuroeconomics. So the one was the economics, which is the official doctorate, but I also had to publish 3 other fields. So one was in law, so particularly constitutional law in terms of human rights. And I chose a subject in medical human rights. And so I had to publish an article, which I will list it later at the end of where that article can be found, which is also taught in law schools. Another area of expertise was, of course, neuroscience. So I had to have something published somewhere. And that's my chapter 2 of my dissertation, which is published in the journal PLOS 1, where I'm discussing neuroscience experiment via economics, which is the actual neuroeconomics part of it. I also had it was a presentation on the internet. That was the business part that I also had to do. And I don't know why I had to do that, but that was also part of the game. And I had to present, that was at Congress, and remotely I presented. And this was about the internet at the time when squatting on the internet, meaning stealing of the address, the domain name, and then selling it at a higher price was very popular. And so I was presenting a paper on that to the Congress. So neuroeconomics is basically a whole lot of fields combined together. It's primarily economics, but in my case, I was much less interested in the economics part and much more interested in how the brain works. So I've also had a certification from Harvard University on functional magnetic resonance imaging. So that was an additional course I had to take to learn how magnetic resonance imaging works and how the machine works. I'm officially certified to operate one. And so what neuroeconomics then does is looks at people and takes a look why they made the decision that they made. So some of the things that you can find today that are really unusual is, for example, the latest one, the huge arbitrage, the Reddit stock market crash that it caused, or not crash, but so completely unnamed stocks suddenly took over and millions of dollars were lost by major companies in the market. This cannot happen according to the standard economic theories, but it can happen according to neuroeconomics.
Wow. that's so crazy. Okay, so what did we miss? Can you operate on our brains? Can you shoot rockets in outer space? Like what other what other things what other highly complex things can you do? That's crazy.
Okay, so I can't operate. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an MD. But what I can do is, if you are willing to be part of an experiment where I can examine your brain using an MRI scanner that's attached to a functional part, which means basically is that it's looking at the oxygenation of certain parts of your brain. And I can have you do tasks in the scanner. So imagine yourself being in an MRI machine, which is noisy and tiny and really uncomfortable. And you have to keep your eyes open and you have to look at the computer screen, but I'm giving you instructions and you have to follow those instructions. And my instructions will be, think of eating a steak, or think of somebody's chasing you or killing you in the street, stuff like that. And just giving you examples. So then I can see what part of your brain is reacting to what I'm telling you to do as you are following, assuming that you're following the instructions you're capable to follow. And so you have a little button to communicate whether you do or you don't. You can't communicate, or I show you pictures, or I have you make decisions. So these kind of things then tell me what part of your brain works. And I can then see, is it really the part of the brain that economists think it should be, which is your prefrontal cortex, because all your decisions are made there. Wow. Is that true? And it's not true.
Huh. That's so crazy. That's very cool. How did you get interested in migraines?
Wow, I got interested in migraines because I had migraines. So this was a selfish prophecy at the beginning, because I had serious migraines. I started when I was 10 or so, 10 years old, in my teens, early teens. But at that time, I didn't know I had migraines. They sort of manifested like cyclical vomiting syndrome and irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Wow. And so nobody really considered these to be migraines. But I later realized that, much later, actually, just pretty recently, I realized that these are actually migraines. If they're a form of migraines, or could be migraine precursors. So as a child, when you develop your migraine brain, and we'll talk about that, what that means, it's a process. And so as you're creating the necessary parts of the brain to become a migraineer, certain things are turned on and other things are not yet turned on. And so it can manifest in a huge number of ways that you are a migraineer. So for a long time, I didn't know I was a migraineer. My first actual headache type migraine hit me after the birth of my second child. I was 29. And then it just got worse as time went on. So there was no pain associated with my earlier migraines. I had other kind of symptoms.
Wow. Huh. Well, I found you through your content on the Carnivore Cast podcast that Scott Mislinski does. He has helped me immensely over the years in understanding a carnivore diet. And I heard you there. And I think previous to that, I would have just assumed that a migraine was a bad headache. Can you explain what is different about a migraine that isn't just a headache?
Right. So that's an excellent question, because I would say that 99.99% of the people, excuse me, who are not migraineurs don't know that migraine doesn't even need to have a headache to come with it. We kind of sort of know that there are people who have aura, and we associate that with migraine, but we don't go further, and we don't realize that people who have aura oftentimes don't have a headache to go with a migraine. So migraine isn't synonymous with a headache at all. While a very large percent of the migraineurs do have a headache that comes with it, and it can be an excruciating bad headache, it's not really a defining migraine at all, because so many people can have a migraine without it. So if you can have a migraine without a headache, then we can't say that it's a headache. It's not even a type of headache. It's just a disease or a condition that oftentimes comes with a headache, but it need not to. But there are some other ways that you can differentiate. So for example, when you get a headache, you can pretty much get a headache just randomly. You get a headache from something, you can take a pain pill, something over the counter, and it's going to disappear pretty soon. Most headaches respond to some over-the-counter medication. Migraines will not respond to it because there is a different cause of the headache. In addition, if you have a standard headache, your head can hurt anywhere. It can be your forehead, it can be the whole head, it can be throbbing, it can change, do all kinds of things. Migraine isn't like that. Migraine hurts only on one side of the head, And we can go into why that is. It's quite complicated, why only one side. But if you just see of the brain as two hemispheres, and we know that it's two completely distinct hemispheres of the brain, and each hemisphere has different roles. And so I can't have at the same time two parts of the brain active. I mean, I can, but it's really, really rare. Because if you do, then you would have two completely different kinds of migraine symptoms at the same time as well. So, for example, aura can be on both sides because the eyes, the visual cortex is on both sides of the brain. The same with the ears and the same with the eyes, but not so with the taste, not so with the speaking, not so with a whole lot of other things, not so with comprehension. So when we're talking about like a migraine may show up, for example, that you temporarily lose half of your body, meaning semi-paralysis, just temporarily. It may just be a droopy lip or a droopy eye. It may just be minimal like that. But this is just on one side. And this is why people often consider a migraineur that, hey, this might be a stroke, so go to the emergency room.
Wow.
Because it's very difficult to distinguish a true migraine from a stroke.
Will somebody always have the same sphere? Will it always be on the same side for a migraineur?
No, there's some variations, but usually on the same side. So, for example, I have my migraines on the left side of my brain, but time to time, and I shouldn't say brain because I don't actually have it on the left side of my brain. I feel it on the left side of my head, which is in the right side of my brain. But time to time, I feel what appears to be a potential migraine on the other side of my head. But what I find then is that I didn't have the required prodromes, and I haven't mentioned that. The difference between a headache and a migraine is that you also must have prodromes. Prodromes means meaning before the actual event. So a migraine is always, without exception, preceded by some event, something that 99% of the migraineurs don't find. They miss it. And if you don't miss it, if you find it, and this is what I teach, how to find it, if you find this prodrome, then you can prevent your migraine. So in a headache, you don't have a prodrome, but in a migraine, you do. So it's a completely different setup for the whole body. And so, for example, a very typical prodrome for a migraineur, which is becoming more and more clear that nearly all migraineurs have it, is one eye becomes smaller than the other right before a migraine. And it's typically on the opposite side from the migraine side. So, for example, my migraine pain is going to be on the left side of my head, but my right eye will suddenly become smaller. So this would be what I said, droopy. So you can't open that eye, or like a lip is going to hang down on one side. You can't move it. It appears like you have a stroke. Your body isn't responding the proper way on that side of your body.
I always run into the question when things like this pop up for clients that I meet with in the structural integration sense of like, why would the body physiologically self-sabotage in this way? Are there any precursors, any genetic component, anything that makes someone more susceptible to getting them?
Oh, absolutely. Very good question. And so this was my question too. And I have a lot of different kind of responses to this because I also wanted to find out that in addition to the fact, okay, so we have this and why do we have this? Is there any benefit to having this in terms of evolutionary perspective? And so, yes, it's genetic. And so what this means is that the body isn't really sabotaging itself. That's just genetically or evolutionary speaking is incomprehensible to do that. So there must have been some evolutionary benefit, particularly since you look at how many people have migraines. Studies show between 12 to 15% of the population has migraines. So when you're talking about such a huge percent, at this point of time, officially, this is a bigger percentage than the number of people who have diabetes or obese officially diagnosed. So when we're talking about this is like 40, 50 million people who have migraines. And so you have to ask, okay, so if we have so many, and that's just 40, 50 million in the US, by the way. So if you have so many people having migraines, and we know that it's genetic, this is being already proven and shown, why would it happen? What are the benefits of having this genetic variant? How come it didn't die out? Because if it is a genetic variant that has some disadvantage generally speaking, it dies out from the population, correct? Because the people don't reproduce, and then the gene isn't passed on. But the migraine gene is passed on. It is so genetic, you can inherit it from your mother or your father or both, may even skip a generation and come back. Like in my case, it skipped my parents completely. Neither one of them had even as much as a headache, but my grandmother was a migrainer. So it can even skip generations. So you have to ask, what's so special about this gene that remains in the population and it isn't washed out over the number of generations as we go? And what I found out is that migraineurs have, so let me back up and explain first what migraine is. And then I think there's a better light in understanding the genetic evolutionary connection. So if you look at migraine brain, it is basically a difference in the anatomy of the migraine brain. So we all have neurons. Neurons are the brain cells, basically, that they communicate to each other via electricity. So voltage is moving from one cell to the next, and the voltage itself kicks out neuropackets. These are neurotransmitters. Some of them you're familiar with, like dopamine, serotonin, etc. These are being used as communication packets. And so neurons communicate to each other via communication packets. And in a migrainer's brain, there are more connections between certain neurons. And this is a physiological and anatomical difference. So this is the migraine brain. A migrainer has a lot more connections among his or her sensory neurons. So to simplify this, think of the nose where you smell something, and of course the olfactory nerve coming up into your brain. Every single human has it who can smell. And migraineurs has the exact same nose and the exact same olfactory bulb as everybody else does. But the number of connections of the neuron itself is much greater than somebody who doesn't have migraines. This frequency of connections means that the message coming in is amplified. So instead of a glass of water coming into the brain in terms of a smell, we're getting a bucket full of water because there's more neuron chatter is happening, more information is passed on.
Can we start to see that in the development of like a baby, even in utero?
Yes,
Wow.
we already have babies at age 1. And actually, I read a few articles that mentioned that a colicky baby is likely a baby with a migraine brain.
Interesting.
I was colicky. That's so funny. Wow. I didn't know that.
So that's a developmental phase. And it may or may not express because genes, of course, they don't tell us who we are. They tell us who we can be. And then, of course, there are epigenetic factors that can affect it. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you were like that when you were a baby, it doesn't mean you will evolve into a migrainer later on, because you may change your environment such that it's going to become irrelevant. But as a migrainer in general, so let's just talk about it in general. So if you have more connections in your brain with respect to, say, smelling something, then it must have had some genetic advantage, some evolutionary advantage. Why would your brain, if it's just 1 or 2 people, okay, it's an accidental genetic oops. But when you're talking about millions of people just in the US, 40, 50 million people, then you have to ask, okay, there had to have been some evolutionary benefit to being able to smell better. Then you look at the sensitivity to light. Migraineurs are much more sensitive to light. Same reason. Migraineurs, all the sensory organs associated with sensing light are connected to a lot more neurons. So most migraineurs read very comfortably in a dark room. We have plenty of light because we see better in the dark.
Wow. That's
the same
so
with hearing. It's very interesting because if you think about it, and let me just connect it to the evolutionary benefit for a second here. Think back when we were still living in the savannah and you had to watch out for animals that may take your life. Wouldn't then an ability to see better, hear better, smell better be a benefit to you?
Yeah, of course.
There you go. So it had an evolutionary advantage. So not only did this develop as an evolutionary advantage, but it was maintained in our lives even today because it was such a benefit to have this benefit. And so migraineurs today still benefit from this. We have migraineurs who discover, for example, gas leaks that no one else can detect. And we've had cases where a migrainer said, I detected this gas leak and nobody believed me. And they finally called the gas company and the meter showed that there was a gas leak. Nobody else could smell.
Wow. That's so
So
fascinating.
there are significant benefits to this. So it isn't a bad thing. So we have to look at why it has become a bad thing. And that's another question. And that's a nutritional aspect of it.
Mm.
Do you find any ties, just out of pure interest before we get into the nutrition piece, any ties between a specific personality type in the occurrence of these? Like as you're describing the heightened senses, it seems like someone who would have to be very in tune with inside of their bodies and their immediate surrounding and just be very, I don't know, not to say introverted, but just very interoceptive, I guess.
I tend to agree with that. I think that most migraineurs who I know, at least the ones who have joined me in my Facebook migraine group, and by now we're talking about over 10,000 people combined between the groups, I would say that most of us are pretty outgoing. We're very aware of our bodies. We may be more sensitive to different things that are happening to our bodies because we sense it more strongly, perhaps, and more often we sense it. So we may be more sensitive to different sensations that other people would ignore. We also tend to be more sensitive toward other people. There have been discussions where people were talking about that they can tune into the feelings of other people better. I know that I can't watch a commercial that has anything in it that is empathy related because I will start crying. So it's just like... It's just a given. So I think that it is a different personality, but it also seems to be that most migraineurs seem to be like a AAA. We're driving, hard workers. We're doing much. We're doing more. There are a lot of athletes I work with, a lot of teachers, an amazing number of teachers, researchers, doctors, scientists. So I'm thinking that there is an association, but of course, it's just an association.
Wow.
Very interesting.
So interesting. Okay, so I want you to reiterate something you said earlier, because I think this is really important. And just based on the way you said it, you must get this question all the time. I was talking with somebody about their migraines. They used to get them like 3 days a week and horrible suffering, like hurt to drive, throwing up, like just sounds like the most terrible thing they could ever have. And this person told me that the warning, there would be zero warning. It would be 1 second, he's fine. The next second, somebody took a shovel from behind and just smacked him in the head. But what you're saying is in 100% cases of migraine, there is warning. You just need to learn how to find them.
Exactly. And your friend probably has a lot of warnings, but because it's very difficult to separate the warnings from the actual illness, it becomes very complicated. And also some of the warnings we often associate with good things. So for example, to give you some warning examples, I used to become very chattery, like have excess energy, and I would clean everything and work everything. And the next day, bang, I would come down with a migraine. And so this is a very frequent prodrome that is missed. And in fact, just a few months ago, I had a migrainer saying, I was doing so well. I cleaned the house 10 p.m. I cleaned the kitchen tip to toe. And next day I came down with a migraine. And I said, okay, look back. Was cleaning the kitchen at 10 p.m. a normal activity for you?
Wow.
Because if you look back, that is really not a normal activity, right? If you say that you clean the kitchen at 10 a.m., I may say, okay, so this may not have been connected. But scrubbing your kitchen tip to toe at 10 p.m. to me tells me that you're full of energy. This is a prodrome. This is an unrealistically full of energy. Another prodrome is being grumpy. So the exact opposite. So if you suddenly start to respond to people or get pissed at a commercial or whatever else, which is unreasonable, then you can say, okay, well, maybe this was a prodrome, but it's not something that you will see yourself. It has to be somebody else telling you, why are you so grumpy?
Wow. That's so
See, that's the problem, is that you don't discover that you're grumpy, or you don't discover that you're just overly full of energy. And then there could be other kind of things. For example, if you yawn a lot of people think they're yawning, they're just tired. But yawning is actually nearly the last step of a prodrome, which is associated with the fight or flight symptom. So you don't feel the fight or flight necessarily. Some people do. I do, which is really the kind of feeling where you just want to run out of your skin. A fight or flight is an anxiety coming on you that wants you to run out of the world and to do something. And a lot of people don't realize what it is, or they realize that they're a little bit nervous or something scared them from out of the blue. And then pretty soon they start yawning. And I don't know if it's connected to the evolutionary posturing yawning, where the animals show their incisors as a threat, impulse of showing I'm bigger than you and don't come to fight me. So it could very well be a response to a fight or flight. But yawning is very closely the last thing that happens is a prodrome before the migraine actually hits. And of course, I mentioned earlier the changing of the eye size. And I personally myself haven't noticed that my eye changes, because it isn't something that you do. You don't look into the mirror every minute of the day to see, did my eye size change? And even if you did, because you're so familiar with your face and your brain is so specifically making up the differences, and this is a study part of neuroeconomics, that even if it's not there, if it used to be there, your brain is going to make that up. So you personally won't necessarily see that your eye suddenly became smaller, one eye, because your brain just simply makes it look bigger, because that is what it assumes you see. And the way I found out that my right eye was becoming smaller was my husband telling me, look at your eye. You have a migraine face. I said, what? What is a migraine face? This was maybe 10 years ago. What is a migraine face? And then I started to take selfies of myself regularly, every day, all day long. Every so many hours, I would take a photo and I would upload them on my computer, and I would put them side by side. And I said, wow, my face is changing like every 10 minutes of the day. It's ridiculous. And when I started to come down with the migraine, about a day before the migraine, my face started to change. And about an hour before migraine, my eye size changed.
Wow.
And even ended up with a little bit of darker circle under one eye, worse than the other, and a puffiness over the eye, worse than the other. So there are differences between the two eyes, even in puffiness and in circles under the eyes. Another prodrome, for example, is a localized edema. Like people suddenly can't take off their rings, or their shoes get to be too tight, or the sock mark on the legs, for example. So these would be very typical localized. They would be symmetrical. They would have to be like both ankles swelling, because if it's only one, that could be a heart disease. But if it's both ankles are swollen, that's equally representing a localized edema. And if you're a migraine sufferer, then this is a prodrome for you. And there are a whole host of other prodromes: feeling dizzy, tinnitus suddenly clicking in a little bit louder, etc. And even vomiting itself is a prodrome, by the way. It can also be a symptom, but it's a prodrome as well.
So once you start to identify those things that might pop up for you individually, the eye change or the migraine face, is there anything that you can do to kind of nip it in the bud, or make sure that it doesn't hit you as hard, or do you just have to ride it out from that point?
No, this is a point when you can actually act and prevent your migraine. So you definitely don't want to write it out. This is your warning. This is when your body is telling you, I'm out of balance, do something. And so we need to know at this point of what is exactly out of balance. We know that it is your electrolyte, but we don't know if it is going to be the potassium or sodium. And here's where history a little bit helps, and where nutrition comes into the picture. And let me just now quickly summarize, and then we can talk about the nutrition afterwards. But in general, migraineurs are carbohydrate intolerant and glucose sensitive. And medical terms, glucose sensitivity means diabetes, type 2 diabetes, but that's not what I mean here. What I mean here is that migraineurs will become diabetic if they continue eating glucose, because they're so carbohydrate intolerant. Because when glucose enters the cells, it kicks out sodium and water from the cells. So it eliminates the sodium from the cells, which would normally be not a problem if you're not a migraineur, because you have plenty of sodium in your system. But the migraine brain is different. And so that ends up causing a major electrolyte imbalance. And as I noted earlier, the migraine brain has more neuronal connections with the sensory neurons. And as a result of the more connections, there's more chatter going on. And as a result of the more chatter, there's more voltage that has to be happening in the brain. And what is creating the voltage? Sodium. It's sodium entering the cell and potassium coming out of the cell is what's causing the neurons to generate a voltage in certain particular areas in the cell. So when we eat carbohydrates and glucose, this causes an efflux of the sodium from the cells. Therefore, the brain of the migrainer suddenly experiences a huge electrolyte imbalance. So the prodromes that the migrainer sees are associated with this electrolyte imbalance. So what we need to know is what has caused the electrolyte imbalance. It need not be just carbohydrates or glucose. It can be menstrual or cyclical menstrual cycles, or it could be ovulation. Many women have both, unfortunately, the cycle as well as ovulation. It could be the full moon, because that initiates an evolutionary pattern of the fight or flight and paying more attention to what's happening around us. It also can be, for example, from a barometric pressure change. It can be a huge drop in pressure or an increase in pressure, both of which change the weight of the atmosphere on us. So it can cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation, both of which affect the electrolyte. And so now you can see what I'm talking about is that the problem of a migrainer is the electrolyte imbalance. And we need to somehow reset this imbalance. But it's important for us to know what caused the imbalance. So knowing the prodrome is great. I have the prodrome. I have an imbalance. But what do I do next? What is it that I have done? Or what did the environment do around me or in me that caused the electrolyte imbalance? And once I understand what caused it, then I can act upon it. So for example, if I ate a lot of carbs and I removed a lot of sodium from my system and also water, but the water moved into edema. So I can tell because I now have swollen ankles, swollen fingers, puffy eyes, and I can see I have edema collected here and there, gained a pound or so. And then I know that I have collected water outside of my cells because the sodium left. And normally sodium is the one that is holding the water, not in the cell, but in the interstitial space, which is around the cell, so that the water can move in and out of the cell by osmosis as natural as it would. But if I removed all the sodium, then I sort of kind of disrupted this balance. So have some sodium, have some salt, no water, just salt. And what salt is going to do is bring the water back into the location where it should be. It will pull it out of edema. I had, for example, one person who ate something and ended up with major edema like this, and it lasted for days and days and days. So she went to the doctor, and the doctor gave her a diuretic. And a diuretic will remove the edema from the blood. It's not going to take it from an edema sitting in your ankles. So that's the wrong thing to do for a migraine edema. You really need to use just salt, and the salt will pull the water back very quickly within 10, 15 minutes.
Wow.
Another case, if you, is a pressure, barometric pressure changes. So whether it's an increase or decrease in the barometric pressure, you can adjust your salt or potassium consumption. And we don't supplement potassium, we just eat high potassium food. But so you change the sodium and potassium balance continuously. So everything that we do to prevent migraine when we find that we have a prodrome is to discover whether we are deficient in sodium or in potassium.
Do you ever find any links between migrainers and dysfunctioning pituitary system, specifically adrenal glands?
Genetically speaking, there's probably some connection to the adrenal gland because of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, but I find that it isn't active if it exists. Because then I would see some kidney issues, I would see excess urination issues, et cetera, and I don't. I see that we have 2 migraineurs out of 10,000 who have diabetes insipidus, and so they clearly have an adrenal issue. There's also a couple of people, of course, there's adrenal fatigue, which is a different condition altogether, that totally disappears once they increase sodium. So I'm not sure that these are in any way together with migraine. I think these are independent conditions that sort of also are salt sensitive, perhaps, but they aren't migraine related.
Very interesting.
So I think what most people would think at this point is, well, I can't have salt because my blood pressure is going to go up. But most people don't realize on a low carb diet, it's very, very different than you're on a low fat diet. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. And it's very correct. And it's probably the number one question I always get. And my number one answer is that look at my migraine group with 10,000 migraineurs in it. We've been in business for 7 years and we eat a lot more salt than the USDA. In my case, it's about 3 times the USDA every single day. And my blood pressure not only hasn't increased, it's completely stable, has always been low, still low, it didn't change. So it is very much associated with your vascular health. So let me back up here because nutrition itself has a lot to do with vascular health, and we know that that is the case. But if you're coming from the SAD diet, standard meaning standard American diet, and you now switch over to the low carb or keto or carnivore diet, your vascular health may still not be healthy for a long time to come. So just because you switched a diet, it doesn't necessarily mean you can also increase your salt right away. So let me explain how salt works in a vascular system and why it is believed that it increases blood pressure. So as you know, salt will attract water. That's what it does. It collects water. And so does glucose for that matter. So sugar does the same thing. Both of them can be put into a little food packet to keep the food packet completely dry. Both will suck up moisture, but we only blame salt. And so why do we do that? And why aren't we blaming sugar? And it's an interesting question because if you look back at how the vascular system works, we always have glucose in our blood. So we assume that glucose is okay. And we have glucose in there because our red blood cells have no mitochondria, so they have to use glucose directly. That's about the only thing. There are a couple of little organs like our retina and a little part of the kidney and a very small part of the brain that also has to use glucose. But over 80% of our cells actually prefer to use fat. And so, however, we don't know that. What we see in the blood is that it has glucose. So we assume that eating glucose is good. And anything that we eat that has glucose must be good. So grains are good. Vegetables and fruits are good. Sugar is okay, right? This is how we are told. And the things that we have in the blood, such as fat, must be bad because our arteries are clogged up with fat and cholesterol. So that must be bad. But this thought is like having a fire because we have a fireman there, not that we have the fireman there because of the fire. Yeah. So we know that we got this backwards, but how does this work? So when you have a very healthy artery system, then if you increase your salt and this attracts more water, so you're going to be drinking more water, you increase your blood volume. And if you have a given length of pipe and you increase the amount of water within that pipe, then if the pipe can stretch a little bit, width-wise, not length-wise, but width-wise, to allow for the extra volume of blood or water in it, nothing is going to happen. Your blood pressure is not going to increase. So in a healthy person who eats, say, a jambon, which is the French or Italian very salty ham, right, which most ancient Europeans even ate. That's how we preserved our meat, was with salt. And we drank water. If you're a healthy individual and you eat meat and salt, and you drink water, then your blood volume will increase and your arteries and blood vessels are going to just become fatter and nothing is going to happen. Your blood pressure will remain the same. Your blood pressure won't change just because you ate a pig's head. It's just not going to happen in evolutionary term. But if you also eat a lot of grains and also eat a lot of vegetable oils and seed oils and eat a lot of sugar and a lot of pesticides to go along with your vegetables and fruits. And also we now know that vegetables have a lot of anti-nutrients in them, including phytates and lectin and oxalates and other goodies in there that are very harmful and block the absorption of the nutrients from plants. So when we eat all these strong inflammatory foods, then our vascular system will become stiff. It's going to be inflamed. And just like when you hit your arm and it becomes red and swollen, it's going to be really harmful if something is touching it. And so you don't want to touch it and it's going to become swollen a little bit. Your whole vascular system can become swollen a little bit and it's going to be hurting everywhere. And it's going to be easier to damage it. So this is what then is going to cause a problem, that if you have an inflamed artery system, your vascular system, and then you increase your blood volume, that's going to hurt. It's going to be harmful for you. And then you're going to have an increased blood pressure. But we have to look at not what it is now, but what caused what it is today. So we have to look to see what caused you to become inflamed. Why is your artery system not able to just simply become a little bit wider to allow room for that extra volume of blood? And that's because of the inflammation, which was caused by the sugar. It was caused by the grain, caused by the seed oils, caused by all the foods that really aren't foods for human in evolutionary sense. And so once you look at it this way, then you can understand that salt is not the one that is causing the problem, but it's what we ate before the salt. And another reason why we have to look at it this way is that the amount of glucose in the blood, the combined glucose that we store in the blood, is only 4 grams, which is 1 teaspoon. And then we have enough glycogen in the blood, in the body, which is 300 grams of glycogen, which is a starch form of glucose that we store in the liver and in the muscles. And so when you look at that, 300 grams is what is that? It's approximately maybe less than a pound. So about 3/4 of a pound, right? If you take a person, an average person, and you take everything out of that person, you completely dissolve that person and look at the parts, there will be between 1 to 1.5 pounds of salt in that person.
Wow.
So there will be a lot more salt in that person than glucose anywhere combined in the body. So why are we so scared of salt? It isn't the salt that's the problem. It's part of every single cell, everywhere.
Wow. So, okay. We just tend to do this, don't we? We create a problem and then we blame the wrong thing. And then we develop industries around that and try to sell people pills and potions and supplements and whatever else you want to fix the problem that was never really the problem. And everybody makes a ton of money and people get sick and sicker, never fix the problem. It's just total insanity. It's total insanity.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. But it's a business. It's a money-making business.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right. I can walk, I would probably drive. I could drive down to the soda store and get a bucket of soda for $2 that has way more sugar than what you even mentioned that we can even store in the body. And then I'm going to want to snack with that. So I'll eat some potato chips and there's your seed oils and grains and it's got salt in it. And now we're going to blame the salt for the high blood pressure.
Exactly. And then if you look at this bottle of drink that you just told me about, and you will see a bottle of water next to it, check next time which one is more expensive.
So crazy.
So
Sure.
just along the lines of what you were talking about with inflammation and in regards to nutrition and that interstitial space just basically being so inflamed from the inside out that there's just no room for anything to move or regulate or get detoxed out of the system. I'm wondering from a structural perspective with scar tissue or connective tissue adhering anywhere as far as like the brain, the occipital area, mandible, anywhere in the upper body, do you find any links between that pressing on nerves or not allowing nerves to do what they're meant to do and that triggering migraines?
No. And the reason why not is because the nerves are not really functioning alongside the same vascular system. So they separated from the vascular system. But what we find in migraineurs is many of the migraineurs are or have more sensitive neurological systems. And some of the nerves, like cervicogenic pain, is very strongly associated with migraine. It's not a migraine itself, but I guess because migraineurs hold their head in the wrong direction and the wrong way for a long time, they may end up with pinched nerves in the neck. And also, as I noted with the glucose intolerance, it is associated with type 2 diabetes. So if migraineurs eat carbohydrates a lot, they may not become diagnosed as type 2 diabetics, but basically they have diabetes to some level. And that could be a neuropathic damage caused by diabetes, which is an inflammatory condition. So it isn't really a migraine related and associated directly. It can be indirectly because migraineurs have more neurons and perhaps more nervous system connections also everywhere else in the body that there has been no study on that to confirm or to even speculate. But we do know that because of the glucose sensitivity, the inflammation caused by glucose or carbohydrates in general can cause a bigger damage and a bigger inflammatory response. So I find that migraineurs are more inflamed in general and are more sensitive to, for example, grains or other kind of inflammatory foods. But they're not different in terms of cardiovascular disease. In fact, I find that migraineurs have less because we have low blood pressure. That's another genetic trait associated with migraine. We have low blood pressure to start with. So even if we eat a bad diet and our blood pressure increases, it just goes to normal, even though we are actually inflamed and sick. Does that make sense?
Yes, very interesting. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
So the diet that you recommend primarily for most people sounds like it's a fairly carnivore or carnivore adjacent type diet. Is that correct?
Right, correct. And I don't say every person because not everybody is the same. So I recommend that everybody tries and gives it a good try because evolutionarily speaking, that is our base. That's our baseline.
Yeah.
But then because we've had at least 10,000 years of post-evolutionary farming and growing grains, we are no longer the same humans as we were 12,000 years ago. So eating the same exact food for everybody may not be suitable. So for example, a carnivore diet, as good as it is, if people eat only once a day, and I've seen this happen before in women, they stop menstruating. That's a sign of stress. So while evolutionarily speaking, I'm sure that in ancient times, we ate only meat and only perhaps once a day or maybe even less. In our modern, highly stressful daily lives, it may not be 100% suitable. So if a young woman in her 20s and 30s stops menstruating as a result of her dietary change, that's a sign to go back to what they were doing before and start again. Evaluate what kind of changes to make. So what I recommend for everybody to do is to get on the low carb diet first. And in my migraine groups, and I'm working mostly with migraineurs, not all migraineurs. Now I'm getting a lot of people in the group who are not migraineurs. And of course, the families of the migraineurs are also, even though they're not in the group, they're being taken care of by the group. And so we're talking about maybe 20, 30,000 people total as a result.
Wow.
Who we handle, and like a mother may be in for the name of four for children, etc. So we're working with a lot more people. But what I do in the group is that everybody goes on a low carb high fat, which in my case is a 60% fat, and the protein can go 20 to 25%, and the carbohydrates 15 to 20%, depending on the person. And then I run a very similar test to Kraft. Are you familiar with Joseph Kraft in situ test?
Yeah.
So for those who listen and who are not familiar, that's a 5-hour test. And what he was doing is he was testing their blood glucose and blood insulin after an oral glucose sample. So they would be drinking a 50 or 70 gram glucose, I forget now which one. And then every hour he would take a blood sample testing their glucose and their insulin. And he drew up curves placing people into 4 categories of completely healthy people and then different levels of diabetes. So for him, and I completely agreed with him, that there's only one diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So everybody, even the smallest of insulin resistance, is a type 2 diabetes, just at a different level yet. And so what I do, I can't measure insulin, at least people not at home, and I don't want them to eat glucose because, as I noted, migraineurs are glucose intolerant. So they switched to the low carb diet. So it's pretty standardized what they eat. There's only so much you can eat on the low carb diet, and we choose which foods are not part of the diet. So starches are not part, grains are not part. You can't really eat fruits that are tropical fruits. Like if you eat a banana, you will hear from me, stuff like that. So there's a certain type of foods that they can put in there. So it's pretty steady, stable. And most people eat pretty much the same thing. And because of the high protein requirement, they have to also meet a leucine threshold to initiate protein synthesis. And so when we're talking about what they eat, it's usually going to be a lot of bacon, a lot of eggs, or a steak or fish with eggs. And it's going to be maybe some strawberries or raspberries on the side, and maybe some pepper, onion, tomato, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So it's pretty much the same. And because everybody has to be within the same percentages, even pretty much the calories are the same, maybe a little bit off, plus and minus. So we're pretty similar in what we eat and how we eat them. So I can use this as a good baseline, and I can create an expectation of what their blood test is going to look like. And so what I do is I mimic the Kraft test, but instead of checking it every hour, they're to check it every half an hour. And I also check the ketones. So instead of using insulin, I'm using blood ketones as a proxy. And I can do that because when ketones are high, insulin is low, or I should say when insulin is low, ketones are high.
Yeah, that's right.
And when insulin is high, ketones are low.
Yeah.
And so I can use this knowledge of how the two move and what happens if I also see the blood glucose change. And I'm taking their blood glucose, or they doing their own. So everybody has to purchase a test that we use, a test kit that we use. We don't sell it, so we don't make any money on it, but we have recommendations, and we're international. So everybody basically buys whatever they can, but they have to check their blood glucose and blood ketones. And so they test it at fasting, then pre-meal, and then for every 30 minutes, minimum 5 hours postprandial. And if it looks like that they're crashing at the end, then they have to continue until either they fully crash or they start increasing, meaning they release some glycogen. And so we want to know this because we want to know if they crash, then they have to come back up from that. So we have to continue the test, but they have to exercise or they have to eat, depending on the size of the crash. And so I can then see from this test their metabolic health very well. So it isn't guessing. Then I can see, okay, this person is crashing. This person should go on the carnivore diet, because on the carnivore diet, you don't eat any carbs. So your insulin is not so stimulated. And so then you're less likely to crash. I was just going to say, if you don't crash, say your blood glucose stays very high all the time, then I may actually pull you into the keto group, which is another group that I run, where I make you fast. So I will have different procedures depending upon what I see on this test.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned that Facebook group, and it is super helpful. I've been on there. A lot of people give really good, advice and results, and you're on there all the time helping people. I see the people that have suffered for so long, and they're just like full of hope and gratitude, and it's such a cool page. But then you see exactly the same thing as you would expect if I were just to go straight to a carnivore page, where it's like, wow, I don't have migraines anymore, and now my eczema is gone, or I can get tan in the sun now, or I lost 30 pounds, reversed, chronic disease. Like all of the expected things happen as a side, benefit. And it's like you said, just give it a try. Give it a good try. It's not going to hurt anything. And you might notice that it's the best thing you've ever done.
Exactly. And you see a lot of gratitude, but we do have a little bit of a difference between just going for a general everyday carnivore diet or keto diet. So many people from other carnivore groups or keto groups join us because if you're a migrainer, that may not be sufficient because of the salt problem.
Interesting. That's such a good point. So you wrote your book. Tell us a little bit about your book and the format that you wrote it in.
Okay, so my book format is about to change actually because I'm just writing a third edition. So the title that you gave earlier is the first edition. And I have a second edition that is currently in the market, which has the words complete guide in the middle. So it's Fighting the Migraine Epidemic complete guide.
Gotcha.
And this particular one is a nearly 700-page book. The first book is no longer sold. So this is almost 700 pages. I couldn't make it more. I couldn't include any more in it because there's a limitation on book size. But the way it is set up, this one is set up in a way, of course, a little bit of introduction about me. And because it's primarily a book about me, the first edition was just purely me. This is what I did. If this works for you, then that's great too. So since it did, and a lot of people have joined the migraine group and read the first book, and since it worked for so many people, I then wrote this second one, which tells you about the first book. It tells you on the first chapter will tell you, if you now have a migraine, what do you have to do to stop it? So I will give you some hints of what to do, but it's much more complicated than what's in there. And so in the third book, I'm removing that section because it can confuse people. The next part in the book covers what migraine is. So I have a little bit of chemistry in there, a little of biology, a little bit of physics, a little bit of everything to explain what it is. It's quite difficult. So I have a section on just terminology explaining what is what. And then I explained what migraine is, then also discuss a little bit about nutrition. Then I have a section that I call drugs of shame, which is the kind of medications that migraineurs are given as prescription medications, and what those medications do and what they don't do. And then the last section of the book is for doctors and scientists, explaining the genetics of migraine, what it really is, which is a channelopathy, which we haven't talked about, and how and why the drugs don't work, and why the procedures that I recommend, do work.
That's fantastic. We'll make sure we get the exact right book in the show notes so people can go and find that. Before we let you go, we have to ask you about a study that you did about a decade ago, I believe, that you were looking at oxytocin and generosity. I think that's right. So cool. And I'd love to hear you explain what you did and what you learned.
Sure. That was the love of my life. It was a really fascinating study. So basically, if you look at classical economics posits that all humans make rational decisions, and they define rationality in a very narrow way that says that if somebody gives you some money, even if it may or may not benefit other people, you will still take it because you're rational. And even if you're given 1 penny over $1 million, you will still take that 1 penny without looking at anything else. So a rational human has no feelings, no emotions, none whatsoever. And so neuroeconomics experiments, such as mine with oxytocin, were to basically create an opposition to this, because we all know that this isn't true. And my experiment was a real blinded, randomized clinical trial. Just like for medications, and I used placebo, and then also used oxytocin. And then a third part was using vasopressin, which is the opposite of oxytocin in this regard. And we used saline nasal spray, that for the placebo was just saline, and then for the drug was oxytocin or vasopressin. And these were, 2-3 different experiments. And then we placed these people up against each other such that they didn't know each other. They didn't know who was playing with whom, so it was hidden. And they never learned what the other person did. And so they basically acted secretly alone. So this then could tell me if the oxytocin, which is like a hormone in the brain, it's a neuropeptide, but it's a hormone in the body that is, now we understand, has a lot of functions in how we behave. We at that time didn't know. So I wanted to see, if I give you this oxytocin up your nose, is that going to make you more generous? Because if you're sitting in front of a computer in a room and you're given $10 and you're told that you can share this $10 with a stranger you have never met, you never will meet, and the person will never know whether you shared or you didn't. They will get some money if you shared, but they won't know who shared it. In other words, your secret. Normally, a rational economic theory will say that you will not share. You will take the $10 and go. Because why would you share with somebody you don't know, you're not connected to? They will not discover that you didn't share. It's secret, so why would you share? But what we found is that some people do share, even without oxytocin. But when you give them oxytocin, nearly all share, and nearly 50-50. Wow. See, oxytocin basically modified how you saw that other person. And in terms of evolution, oxytocin appears in mammals first. It starts to appear in fishes a little bit because they're shoaling, but it doesn't appear in any animal species before that. And in mammals, it actually supports a family structure. So it's a bonding hormone. And so the fact that today you can get on a bus with 2 million other people who you don't know and you don't kill them is basically because of your oxytocin.
Wow. That's so cool. That's a really beautiful study.
It was an amazing study. And then vasopressin did the exact opposite, which vasopressin, by the way, we use frequently as a drug for people who have urinary issues, like you urinate too much, like diabetes insipidus, or underdeveloped kidneys, or women who have urinary incontinence. They're given vasopressin as a drug. Yet I have shown in my research that vasopressin makes people more aggressive and more frugal.
Wow, that's amazing. What a cool study. It sounds like you did that in a really well-designed way. And yeah, that's so cool to talk about. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We've learned so much about migraines and about all kinds of things, and we've heard your content in other places, and we know that we could talk to you about a million things and go for a million hours. It's super fascinating. I would like to close out the conversation by asking our standard question, but I'm just going to tweak it a little bit, which is, what is one simple thing that somebody could take away from this conversation and apply in their life? But I would like to hear one simple thing that they could take away and apply in their life that came from that oxytocin study. What's something practical that people can learn from that? Because I think that's so rad.
Okay, so from the oxytocin, the biggest takeaway, I think, is that we aren't who we think we are. We are what our hormones are, and our hormones are what we eat. And so the biggest takeaway is that an unhealthy society is going to have an unhealthy behavior with respect to anything that we do, including shopping, eating, fighting, society, race, everything you think of. So a healthy nutrition with a healthy mental system and brain system and a healthy hormonal system will make a healthier decision. Clearly, oxytocin is a hormone of a higher level, mammalian hormone that is very specific to how humans should be bonded and tolerant. And I suppose we're not always using that the proper way, but we could.
That is very well said. I love that. Where can people go to find your work?
Well, obviously, there are several works that they can find to me, and I will send you a full list. But the work on oxytocin, and prior to the migraine, I had a book, and I had participated in a lot of books as invited author, even the Encyclopedia of the Brain. So I will send you some of the literature on that. Also the legal article. And then in terms of migraine, people can find me on Twitter at Migraine Book. That is my handle there. Instagram, which is Dr. Angela Stanton. I have 2 Instagram accounts, but that's the only one that I have been using. LinkedIn, Angela Stanton, PhD. These are all one words everywhere. Facebook, of course, I have a personal page, which is Angela A. Stanton, PhD. And the Migraine Protocol group, which would be Migraine Sufferers, one word. They can find me that way. That's the main group. That's a protocol group where you are in as well. And then I have my web pages. I have several web pages. One of them is stantonmigraineprotocol.com, and the other one is stantonmigraineprotocol.org. And for those who are looking for something more controversial, my activist side of me, also cluelessdoctors.com is my webpage as well. And I've write there more controversial articles. Gotcha.
Yeah, we will link to all of that in the show notes. That's great. We're also really looking forward to your appearance at the World Nutrition Summit. That's coming up here pretty soon, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And it's a virtual event, so it was pre-recorded, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I think there's going to be option to participate in some live discussion. I don't quite understand it yet, but I have just received an email from South Africa, so we'll figure out how that works.
Gotcha.
And then we'll see.
Well, that's great. Dr. Angela Stanton, thank you so much for coming on to Boundless Body Radio today to discuss these important matters. We really appreciate you, and we're so grateful for your time and your content.
Thank you, Casey and Bethany. It was wonderful talking to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.